Nora and I met by accident. She and her husband owned a small company which profits from the bounty of foodstuffs created in the Rock Valley, and I was a culinary student who had some downtime and ventured outside of the city for this small food expo that featured various ciders, cheeses, breads, and other assorted food products given away for free after a small admission fee. Since I was broke and paying my way through culinary school, the offer of quality all-you-can-eat food samples for a small admission fee and the chance to get out of the city for a day during a balmy, sunny fall day was too good of an offer to pass up. I had a traveling companion in my buddy, Jason, and we hopped on the train and took the short journey north. The food expo itself was average. Amish pickles and preserves were mixed in cheeses from local creameries, along with various other non-food related businesses trying to hawk whatever product they were making. But there was one good thing at the expo: booze. Drinking in the city is expensive, so I usually drank cheap beer to save money. But here we could sample all the whiskeys and ciders we wanted for a small additional upfront fee. Jason and I were slightly buzzed as we shoved bread and cheese into our faces when a very attractive woman, who looked to be in her early 40s, sat down at a table a few feet from us. We both glanced at her casually and continued our drunken conversation. Jason and I never were good at filtering what we said in front of each other. Political correctness and decorum were things we saved for job interviews and conversations with girlfriends' parents. They weren't high on our priority list as we sipped bourbon and made coarse jokes in public. And it wasn't long before our antics of joke-telling, laughing with mouthfuls of food, and general silliness had the attractive woman at the table a few feet away noticeably laughing at our simple immaturity. I struck up a conversation, and a few minutes later, I found out her name was Nora, and she was here today on business. I even was handed the official business card with her name and company logo on it. We gave her the quick update on what is here today and apologized for our behavior. But she laughed it off and made it clear she wasn't offended. My buddy and I excused ourselves as we had finished our snacks and bourbon and needed to acquire more sustenance. When we returned to our table, Nora had left, and I thought nothing of it as we continued to enjoy our inexpensive food samples. Until we started making our way through the makeshift parking lot back to the train station. I literally bumped into her again. No, seriously, I wasn't paying attention to where I was walking and walked right into her, causing her petite frame to stumble backwards. I immediately apologized. She said that's okay and replied that she had hoped to run into me again. I smiled and offered to buy her a drink to make it up to her. In response, she blushed and covered part of her face with her wedding ring-clad hand before respectfully declining. It was now my turn to hand her a business card of the restaurant in the city where I worked, and I even made sure to jot down my cell phone number on the back and promised to make her a reservation for her if she texted me in advance should she ever wish to come visit. She blushed again at my forwardness and told me she might take me up on the offer. Nora and I started texting. A lot. These texts started, as they often do, with flirting and ballooned into full-on descriptions of explicit acts that I can't mention here. I know it sounds cliché, but Nora was the epitome of the neglected wife. Her husband's drive had deteriorated to the point that they in a non-intimate marriage. Worse yet, the beginnings of his midlife crisis had made her an almost afterthought to him. I would come to find out she texted me not only to satisfy her desire to feel like a woman again, but also just to have a male companion in her life. Out of curiosity, I asked her had she told her husband how frustrated she was with the state of their marriage. She said she had, and his response was that he didn't know what she expected him to do. She said the prospect of living the rest of her life with no pleasure was undesirable to say the least. She loved her husband, and they worked well together in the business. But the bedroom was a different story. She said she wasn't sure if she could live the rest of her life without being intimate with a man. She would ask me questions about culinary school and what life was like in the big city for a southern transplant. Her life of being an ignored wife, mother of two, and part owner of a small business didn't allow her to have much excitement. That's when I began to really encourage her to come take a weekend trip to come see me. I pulled out all the tricks I could. I sent her photos of food I had cooked, nights out on the town I had with buddies from school, as well as other various things I knew would stimulate her mental and intimate appetites. She never said no, but she always seemed apprehensive for obvious reasons, while also outright stating she would love to come see me. Then it finally happened. There was going to be some NY Small Business Owners Convention in the city, which was designed for entrepreneurs to network and gain access to resources to help businesses build and expand. It was supposed to last 5 days. Her husband had no interest in going, but she convinced him it would be a good idea for her to go so she could have some personal time away from the kids and help the business at the same time. He eventually relented. There was no way I could get 5 days of free time from school and work, but I made arrangements for 2 full days off, and I managed a third night off after an early work shift. It gave Nora plenty of time to actually attend the convention and still have time to mix pleasure into her schedule. Normally, when I'm in the kitchen, I have laser-guided focus. The heat, the fast pace, the endless synapses firing as I multitask 5 things at once while listening to orders being barked out and hollering my responses back in return are all things that simply happen seamlessly. Wednesday night wasn't seamless. I couldn't stop thinking about how excited I was to see Nora after work. I got yelled at more than my fair share that night for not having my head on straight, but I didn't really give a shit. Funny enough, my sous chef made fun of me by implying I couldn't focus because I hadn't gotten mounted in forever. I smirked to myself and continued to think about what the rest of the night had in store. As I punched the elevator button for the appropriate floor of Nora's hotel room, I clutched the bottle of red wine I had brought with me to help ease any nerves she and I might have, and noticed this was a pretty damn nice hotel for a small business owner. I would eventually find out that Nora and her husband had plenty of money. Their small business was something he wanted to start after giving up a successful but unfulfilling career in finance. Ding! The sound of the elevator reaching its destination brought me back to reality, as I quickly realized that only a hallway and door separated me from a night of debauchery. I gave a gentle knock on the door and listened to the sounds of footsteps shuffling from inside. A short pause, and then the door unlocking and opening. Her head peeked out from behind the door, giving off a sense of nervous shyness. I combated it with a big, smiling greeting and extending the bottle as a token gift. She invited me in, and her nervousness was palpable. She made a few brief remarks about how thoughtful it was for me to bring her something, and that she had forgotten how tall I was. I tried to put her at ease by teasing her about how short she was. In our previous texts, I had always poked fun at her for being short, and my comment was met with a glare of mock anger, which I returned with a big, eating grin. I finally had the chance to get a good look at her. She had sent me gorgeous photos on a fairly regular basis, but this was my first chance to see her entire body. She was wearing a rather modest, yet adorable, set of cotton pajama bottoms and a white t-shirt. It was almost bedtime after all. The fabric clung tightly to her petite frame. Her perky mounds filled her shirt nicely, and her flat stomach provided ample evidence of all the bike riding she was always talking about. She had trimmed her sandy blonde hair since the last photo of her I had seen, and she complimented me for noticing. I pulled a wine key from my pocket and offered to crack open the bottle of wine. I served it in the finest of plastic hotel drink where this establishment had to offer, and after downing the first and her refill in short order, Nora was noticeably more relaxed. She even began to reach out and touch my arm as we chatted, which, up until this point, was the most physical contact we had ever had other than that one time I accidentally shoved her into the side of a parked car. We both started to get more handsy as we became more comfortable in each other's presence, and when Nora excused herself to use the restroom, I decided it was time to make my move. When I heard the faucet turn on, I walked to the edge of the bathroom and leaned against the door frame, waiting for it to open. When Nora finally opened the door, she was slightly startled by my presence, but I didn't give her time to dwell on it. I grabbed her wrist and pulled her into me. Now it was on. Having broken down the final barrier, Nora immediately initiated our first kiss. My hands began exploring her body. She kissed with me the passion and ferocity of a woman who had some serious pent-up frustration, and I was a willing recipient of that frustration. She broke our kiss and gasped momentarily as I quickly lifted her off the ground and pinned her against the wall. I held her in place with my hips and steadied her with one arm as my free hand wandered underneath her shirt. She began to breathe heavily and moan into my ear as my mouth moved across her neck and my hand found her sensitive breast. Her hands grabbed 2 handfuls of my hair as I continued nibbling on the soft flesh of her neck and ears. It was as if I could actually feel her body temperature rising as so much heat began emanating from her. When she moaned into my ear how much she wanted me, I made the executive decision that it was time to remove her clothing. I grabbed a firm hold of her and walked her over the bed. A playful shriek escaped her lips as I gently tossed her like a toy onto the bed and stared at her as I ripped off my shirt and undid my jeans. She stared right back at me with a look of pure desire as she bit her lip and waited for me. Leaving only my boxers on, I climbed onto the bed, and her hand instantly reached for me, which I playfully slapped away. She acted shocked before quickly realizing it was her clothing I was going to remove next. I tossed her shirt across the room and finally caught a glimpse of her body with my own eyes for the first time. She was gorgeous and obviously took excellent care of herself. Her stomach was flat, and her narrow waist flared out into some beautifully shaped hips. I pushed her back against the bed and began attacking her flesh with my mouth again. Her hands roamed over my back and shoulders as I nibbled my way down her chest and across her torso. By this point, she was undulating her hips off the bed, so I figured there was no longer any point in waiting. I slid further down the bed and grabbed the waistband of her pajama bottoms, and she, as if perfectly synchronized with me already, lifted her rear off the bed to help me slide them off. Though she had sent me plenty of gorgeous photos, she had never taken off her intimates. This was the first glance I had ever gotten of her glory. It was perfect, and I could smell her feminine pheromones pouring out of her. She was soaking wet and started to breathlessly plead to me. I wanted to tease her, but I was also feeling impatient. I wanted to know what she tasted like. I dragged my tongue across her glory and up to her jewel. She had clamped around my head as I took a second and third pass across her jewel. She was gripping the sheets and taking long, drawn-out deep breaths. My lips locked around her jewel. By this time, her hips were coming off the bed, but I used the grip of my arms around her legs to keep my mouth firmly planted on her. I wanted this woman to arrive like crazy. My right arm released her leg, and I brought my hand up under my chin so I could better explore her glory. She was so excited. My digits immediately set to explore her deliciousness. When her moans became a shriek, I realized the pad of my finger had found that sensitive bundle of nerves on the roof of her glory. I had her exactly where I wanted her now. Her first arrival hit her like an electric shock. She went stiff. Her breathing stopped completely for a few brief moments, and I could feel her muscles clenching even tighter before the dam broke loose. Her glory started gushing, and I had to hold onto her leg with left arm with everything I had as she balked. She crawled away from me slightly and rolled onto her side, clutching a pillow while desperately trying to catch her breath. I looked over at myself in the mirror across the room and beamed with satisfaction. Nora's entire body was flush, but her breathing had begun to return to normal. She rolled over to face me and looked at me with heavy eyes that were completely glazed over. She reached out her hand for me and motioned for me to come here, and I joined her on the bed. I pulled her into my arms and kissed the side of her face. She let out one last deep gasp as her giggling subsided and turned to look me in the eyes and flash a devilish grin. Her hand had found my gardening tool. We began to make out again, but as she started to kiss me more aggressively, her hand moved underneath my waistband and she gripped me firmly. It was her turn to push me back onto the bed. She grabbed me with both of her hands and she went to work. Nora had admitted she had been with 2 guys in high school and 2 guys in college, one of whom was her current husband. She had confided in me after seeing the picture that I had texted to her. She had never had anything the size of mine before. My ego was inflated knowing that the lollipop in her mouth was the biggest one she had ever licked. She used the perfect combination of stimulation. I just laid back and enjoyed this exemplary attention, and thought about how this was the perfect way to end a stressful day. However, as much as I was enjoying this, what I really wanted was to feel was her glory. I grabbed her arms and pulled her on top of me. She responded by smiling at me, knowing exactly what was going to happen next. My hands ran up and down her, enjoying the feeling of her soft skin against. My mouth went back to her adornments and playfully dragging my teeth across their tips. Before I even realized what she was planning, I felt the unmistakable feeling of a wonderfully tight glory enveloping my manhood. At that point, I'm not sure I would have been able to stop anyway. Her glory gripped me like a vice, and she was appreciating the sensation of being filled. Cursing was never something I'd ever heard her do. Yet, as she slowly worked more and more, a stream of delightful filth poured out of her mouth. For some reason, I loved hearing expletives being spoken with such a sweet voice. She almost sounded apologetic as certain words escaped her lips. Not only was it a huge turn-on to feel all the sensations of having her body pressed against mine, but watching her face contort and the shy, nervous woman who answered the door earlier devolve into a swearing vixen was almost enough to make me lose it too early. Both of my hands grabbed her as we settled into a slow, steady rhythm. She felt amazing. I didn't tell her this, but I had never experienced a woman like her before. How any man could ever neglect a woman with such an amazing body like hers is beyond me. If I were her husband, I'd go get some blue pills, testosterone shots, or something so that I could enjoy this goddess on the regular. Oh well, his loss is my gain. In my mind, I was lucky to be the one taking advantage of all the pleasure her body had to offer. Her body adjusted to the invading of her glory, and our pace reflected that. To this point, our interactions had been rather manic, almost animalistic in nature. But that slowed down somewhat as we both needed a moment to gather ourselves. Now the pace was starting to pick back up, and she seemed to relish being on top of me. It was a pleasure to watch her cut loose, and when she reached a hand down to rub her jewel, I knew I wanted to see her arrive again. My hands ran all over her as I tried to stimulate every inch of her to help get her over the edge. I told her how amazing she looked and how good her body felt wrapped around me. Suddenly, she went from groaning in pleasure to a high-pitched squeal, and she reached out to grab the headboard above me to steady herself. I grabbed her while she arrived. I had never felt anything like it. It was as if her glory was massaging me. Somehow through it all, I maintained my composure and got to watch this insanely gorgeous woman quiver and squirm as she rode out her second arrival of the night. I loved watching how expressive she was, how she had allowed herself to cut loose and embrace the moment, and especially how gorgeous she looked when her body went flush when she arrived. Now it was my turn though. She had collapsed on my chest, and I grabbed her, and we both rolled over. She was starting to recover, and I had started to stroke her. At this point, I was so turned on, I could barely control myself. What started as slow, long strokes turned into a deep, hard-pounding ones. Her whole body squirmed underneath me, and her face was contorted into something between pleasure and pain. But I was so driven by lust. I wasn't going to stop unless she begged me. Even the fingernails clawing their way down my back only turned me on even more. This poor woman hadn't gotten a proper mountain topping in God knows how long, but she wasn't going to be able to say that in the morning. During more than one of our texting sessions, Nora had made a point of bragging about her flexibility. I wanted to see what she meant. I leaned back and rested on my knees still inside her, and pushed her knees back towards her shoulders. It was surprisingly effortless for her, and it was obvious she hadn't been exaggerating. With her legs pulled back, it allowed for an entirely different kind of friction and sensation. It drove me crazy. Her glory felt like it was molded specifically to fit perfectly around me, and I knew I couldn't hold out for much longer. My strokes became more erratic as I got closer, and it was clear that she noticed. Nora started playing again and begged me in her sweet-sounding voice, and that sent me over the edge. Exhausted and satisfied, I collapsed next to her. We both quickly drifted off to sleep. Both of us had to wake up early to deal with our respective responsibilities, but before we got dressed and parted ways, Nora surprised me and dropped her knees to give me more fantastic attention before I could even pull on my boxers. We made plans to get together again either Friday night or Saturday morning before I left to catch the train to class. Though our first meeting had been built up through months of flirting, texting, and photo exchanges, the meeting still managed to be even better than I anticipated. Now I was going to have to get through 2 days of work and school, and somehow stay focused before I could have her again. It was probably for the best though. We both needed some time to recuperate. I thought for a moment about the fact that she is a married woman. Should I have been more concerned about that? I told myself absolutely not. We're both adults. And rightly or wrongly, I convinced myself that I was doing her husband a favor. She wasn't going to leave him, so had continued to have his business partner. And he'd take care of her need for intimacy, so she wouldn't bother him about it. It was a win-win situation for everyone, right?